My family called me insane for keeping Dad's rusty boat. 3 years ago, at a Thanksgiving dinner that smelled of roasted turkey and betrayal, I learned my family's price for love. But the story doesn't start there. It starts where everything in my life did, at 4:30 in the morning, on the deck of the Sea Wolf, with my hands smelling of diesel and salt. 4:30 in the morning hits different when you're 45 and wondering if this is all there is. The Sea Wolf's engine coughed to life like an old man clearing his throat after a 3-pack-a-day habit. That boat was older than most marriages in this town, and probably more reliable, too. The rust patches on her hull looked like freckles in the dim harbor light, each one telling a story my old man could have recited from memory. I was mending nets when the sun started its daily fight with the main fog. My fingers worked the knots automatically, muscle memory from 30 years of doing the exact same thing. The photograph tucked above the wheel caught the first ray of light. There was Dad, all teeth and sunburn, standing right where I stood now. Same wheel, same view, probably the same worries about the catch being too small. The catch was pathetic that morning. 3 lobsters and some bycatch that wouldn't even cover the fuel. I looked toward shore where those glass towers were sprouting up like mushrooms after rain. Coastal living properties had already eaten up half the old harbor. Every month another fishing family sold out, traded their boats for SUVs and their callous hands for soft retirements in Florida. My phone rang just as I was tying up. The screen showed Rick's face, my brother, the one who made it, the success story. The one Mom would have been proud of if she'd lived long enough to see him in his Italian suits. He didn't even say hello. That should have been my first warning. His voice came through sharp and clean, like he was calling from one of those sterile offices where they keep the temperature at exactly 72 degrees year-round. He told me Coastal Living Properties was making their final offer for our dock, the one Dad left us both. The number he mentioned made my chest tight. It was more money than I'd see in 3 lifetimes of fishing. I kept working while he talked, coiling rope like it was the most important thing in the world. Told him what I'd been telling him for 2 years. It was Dad's legacy, not for sale. His laugh came through the phone bitter as black coffee. He said legacy doesn't pay bills. Said I needed to stop living in the past. Then came the kicker. He expected me at Thanksgiving dinner. Not invited. Expected. Like I was some employee he was summoning to a performance review. The thing about rich relatives is they always assume you want to be like them. They can't imagine someone choosing calluses over conference calls, choosing sunrise over stock options. My brother Rick couldn't understand why anyone would choose to smell like fish when they could smell like expensive cologne. 2 weeks later, I pulled up to Rick's house in my 20-year-old F-150. The truck looked like a hobo at a country club in that neighborhood. Every house had those smart doorbells that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Rick's place was the biggest. 3 stories of glass and right angles that looked like it was designed by someone who'd never heard the word cozy. Susan answered the door, wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. My sister-in-law had this way of looking at you that made you want to check if you tracked something in on your shoes. She air-kissed my cheek like I might be contagious, then led me to the dining room where the whole family was already gathered. The table looked like something from a magazine. You know, those spreads where everything matches and nobody's actually eating the food. My nephews were there in their prep school blazers, looking at their phones. Rick's business partner and his wife. Even cousin Janet from Boston, the one who always posted those motivational quotes on Facebook about grinding and hustling. Rick waited until after the prayer to strike. That's the thing about my brother. He had timing like a shark sensing blood in the water. He pulled out this glossy brochure and slid it across the table like he was dealing cards in Vegas. Dreams Harbor, it said, with artist renderings of beautiful people walking dogs past fountains and boutique shops. Our dock, Dad's dock, transformed into something that looked like it was copy-pasted from San Francisco. Susan chimed in with this fake concern in her voice, talking about how nice it would be to not smell like fish anymore, how they could finally invite their friends over without being embarrassed. She actually used the word civilized, like we were barbarians or something, just because we worked with our hands. Rick stood up then, going into full presentation mode. I'd seen him do this before, the way he commanded a room, made everyone lean in. He talked about Dad like he was giving a eulogy, all respect and reverence. Said Dad was a good man, but not a businessman. Said he left us burdens, not blessings. That rusty boat, those old nets, a dock that was falling apart. Rick painted it all like some kind of prison I needed to escape from. The whole family was nodding along like this was an intervention on one of those reality shows, like they were saving me from something terrible. Then he said the words that made everything else fade to static. He'd already negotiated the deal, already had the contracts drawn up. All he needed was my signature. The paper he pushed toward me had so many zeros, I had to count them twice. At the bottom, a line with my name already typed beneath it, just waiting for ink. Everyone was staring at me. You could hear the air conditioning humming, someone's phone buzzing on silent. I picked up the pen, felt its weight, looked at that photograph of Dreams Harbor again. All those happy, successful people living their best lives where my father once got to fish at sunrise. My hand was shaking, not from fear or excitement, but from rage. Pure, distilled rage that had been building since I walked in and saw their pitying looks. Rick must have sensed my hesitation, because he went for the jugular. Started talking about how I looked to everyone else. The crazy fisherman holding on to junk. The family embarrassment. The one who couldn't let go. He actually said I was dishonoring the Miller name with my stubbornness. That's when I stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. Like Dad used it when he'd heard enough nonsense at town meetings. My voice came out quiet, but it cut through that dining room like a fillet knife. I reminded them that this junk fed our family when Rick was in college, spending money we didn't have. This junk put him through law school. This rusty boat and those rotting docks were the reason he could afford to look down on them now. The room went cemetery quiet. Susan's face had gone from fake tan to real pale. The nephews actually looked up from their phones. Rick's mask finally slipped. The friendly big brother act disappeared, replaced by something cold and sharp. He smiled, but it was all teeth, no warmth, like a barracuda. He told me to lawyer up, said he was filing for petition action, some legal magic where a judge could force the sale of shared property. Said he'd already talked to his attorney friends at the courthouse. They'd take one look at my debts, my tax returns, that rusty boat, and they'd side with progress, side with him. The law was on his side, he said. Time was on his side. Money was definitely on his side. I could fight it and lose everything in legal fees. Or I could sign now and walk away with enough money to actually matter. He gave me until Christmas to think about it. 6 weeks to come to my senses. I left without saying goodbye. Just walked out while Susan was bringing the pumpkin pie, while everyone sat there in shocked silence. The last thing I heard was Rick telling them not to worry, that I'd come around, that everyone has a price. Driving home, watching the harbor lights flicker in my rearview mirror, I remembered Dad's favorite saying, "The sea always pays its debts." Rick thought he was an unstoppable force, a tide that would wash me away. He gave me until Christmas to surrender. 6 weeks. He thought he was giving me a deadline. He had no idea he'd just handed me a map, because in the back of my mind, I could hear Dad's voice telling me about a spot on his charts he'd marked decades ago, a mystery he'd left unsolved. And desperation, well, it's the best damn compass a man could ask for. Desperation might be a compass, but it turns out it's a pretty expensive one. 7 days after that Thanksgiving disaster, reality showed up at my door wearing a sheriff's uniform and carrying papers that felt heavier than anchor chains. The partition action. Rick hadn't been bluffing. The legal document was written in that special language lawyers use when they want to make simple things sound complicated enough to justify their fees. But the message was clear as a lighthouse beam. My brother was taking me to court to force the sale of our inherited dock. The hearing was set for January 15th. I had roughly 6 weeks to find a lawyer. I couldn't afford to fight a battle I couldn't win. I sat there in my kitchen, staring at those papers while my coffee went cold. The morning news was playing on my old radio. Something about Black Friday sales and holiday shopping. Normal people problems. Meanwhile, I was about to lose the last piece of my father that actually mattered. Then, as if God himself decided I hadn't suffered enough, The sea wolf chose that exact moment to have a stroke. I was heading out for what I hoped would be a decent catch. Needed every dollar I could scrape together for a lawyer. The engine made a sound I'd never heard before. Not the usual coughing or sputtering, but something deep and final, like a death rattle. Then smoke. Black, oily smoke that smelled like burned money and broken dreams. Tommy Nguyen from the marina took one look and just shook his head. Tommy had been fixing boats since his family came over from Vietnam in the 70s. If Tommy shook his head, you were done. He quoted me $8,000 for a rebuild. Might as well have been $8 million. I tried 3 other mechanics. Each quote was worse than the last. The cheapest wanted $6,000 up front. Cash only. I had exactly $900 in my checking account and another $2,000 hidden in an old coffee can, my lawyer fund, my ace in the hole, my last shot at fighting Rick. You ever been so broke you had to choose between justice and survival? It's a special kind of mathematics. Every dollar toward fixing the boat was a dollar not going toward legal fees. Every dollar toward a lawyer was another day the sea wolf sat dying at the dock. I started selling my catch right off the pier. No middleman, no fish market taking their cut. Just me with a cooler and a cardboard sign, like some kind of nautical panhandler. The tourists thought it was quaint. Local fishermen looked at me with that mixture of pity and relief you see at funerals. Sad for the deceased, but glad it wasn't them. The worst part came 3 days later. I was sitting on the dock with my pathetic cooler of fish when I heard Rick's voice carrying across the water. He was playing tour guide to a group of investors, all of them in those vest jackets that cost more than my truck. They stopped right where they could see me, though Rick pretended not to notice his brother selling fish like it was 1885. He was pointing at our dock, explaining his vision. I heard words like untapped potential and premium waterfront and architectural digest. One of the investors, a woman with sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, asked about current tenants. Rick laughed, said it wouldn't be a problem, that the current situation would resolve itself by New Year. They walked past me on their way back to Rick's Mercedes. He looked right through me, like I was just another piece of debris that needed clearing. One of his investors dropped a 20 in my cooler, probably thought I was homeless. I kept it. Pride doesn't pay for boat engines. That night, I sat in Dad's old workshop behind the house. It's really just a glorified shed, but Dad had called it his workshop, so that's what it was. I needed to find the deed to the boat, proof of ownership for the court case I couldn't afford to fight. The place still smelled like him, motor oil and pipe tobacco and WD-40. His tools hung exactly where he'd left them. His workbench had a half-finished lure still clamped in the vise, like he'd just stepped out and would be right back to finish it. I found his old sea chest under a tarp in the corner. The thing was older than me. Came over from Ireland with my great-grandfather. The brass fittings had gone green with age, and the lock had rusted shut years ago. I had to use a crowbar to get it open. Felt like I was breaking into a tomb. Inside was everything you'd expect from an old fisherman's life. Photographs yellow with age. His merchant marine papers from the 60s. A compass that didn't point north anymore. Letters from my mother tied with a ribbon that fell apart when I touched it. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth like hidden treasure, his charts. Not just any charts. These were the ones he'd made himself over 40 years of fishing. Every rock, every current, every spot where he'd had luck or lost gear. It was like holding his brain in my hands. All his knowledge drawn out in pencil and ink. Most of the markings made sense. Red X's where he'd torn nets. Stars where he'd pulled in record catches. Arrows showing currents and tides. But there was one section, about 40 miles northeast, that looked different. The notes there weren't practical. They were almost fearful. Next to a spot he'd circled 3 times, he'd written, "Current runs cold as hell itself." Below that, "Nets tear but come up empty." And at the bottom, in shaky handwriting like he'd written it in rough seas, old timers called the Kraken's breath. I sat there staring at those words until my eyes burned. The Kraken's breath. I'd heard whispers about it growing up. The old Norwegian fishermen spoke about it like sailors used to speak about the Bermuda Triangle, a dead zone where the water turned black and nothing lived, where compasses spun and good boats went to die. But here's the thing about fishermen's tales. They're usually based on something. Maybe not sea monsters, but something. And my father, who'd never met a stretch of water he wouldn't fish, had circled this spot 3 times and then apparently never gone back. I found more notes tucked into the chart's margins, temperature readings that didn't make sense, water that was 20 degrees colder than it should be, depth soundings that showed a bottom that shouldn't exist, like an underwater mountain that wasn't on any official map, and one word, written in red ink and underlined twice. Why? That's when I remembered something Dad had told me when I was young and stupid and thought I knew everything about the ocean. We'd been out past the sight of land, just the 2 of us, when he'd gotten this far-off look and said something I'd never forgotten. The sea talks, Mark, not with words, but with signs. Temperature changes, current shifts, the way the birds avoid certain spots. Most folks are too busy to listen. They got their fish finders and their GPS and their weather reports. But the old ways, the ones my father taught me, those still matter. The sea rewards those who truly listen. I thought he was being poetic. Dad had a few beers in him and was getting philosophical like he did sometimes. But looking at those charts, at those careful observations made over decades, I realized he hadn't been waxing poetic. He'd been trying to teach me something. The next morning, I made a decision that would have got me committed if anyone knew about it. I took that $2,000 from the coffee kin, my lawyer money, my last hope of fighting Rick legally, and I walked into Tommy's shop. Tommy looked at me like I'd grown a second head. When I put the cash on his counter, he knew my situation. Everyone at the marina did. Gossip travels faster than tide changes in a small port. He tried to talk me out of it. Told me about a cousin who was a paralegal, might help with the court thing for cheap. Told me I was throwing good money after bad, that the Sea Wolf was past her prime anyway. Told me what I already knew, that without a lawyer, I'd lose the dock for sure. But I pushed the money across the counter anyway. Told him I needed the engine running by Monday. 3 days. He said it was impossible. I said Dad had done impossible things before. Tommy sighed, looked at the money, looked at me, and finally nodded. Word spread to the marina like wildfire. Mark Miller had lost it, completely cracked. Chose a broken boat over keeping his inheritance. Some people looked at me with pity. Others with that kind of disgust you reserve for people who won't help themselves. Even the old-timers, the ones who knew my father, shook their heads. But here's what they didn't understand. I wasn't choosing between the boat and the dock. I was choosing between giving up and taking one last shot. Because in those charts, in those strange notes about impossible cold water and the Kraken's breath, I saw something nobody else could see. I saw my father's curiosity, his unfinished business. A mystery he'd circled 3 times but never solved. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe grief and desperation had finally broken something inside me. But as I watched Tommy tear into the Sea Wolf's engine, spark plugs and pistons scattered across his shop like surgical instruments, I felt something I hadn't felt since Thanksgiving. Hope. Stupid, irrational, completely unjustified hope. The old-timers had a saying, when you've got nothing left to lose, you've got everything to gain. I was about to test that theory with everything I had left. One broken boat, one impossible location, one last chance to prove that my father's legacy was more than just rust and rotting wood. Rick thought he had me beaten. The law was on his side. Time was on his side. Hell, common sense was on his side. But I had something he didn't. 40 miles of ocean between me and a mystery that had haunted my father for decades. Tommy called at dawn on Monday. She's running, was all he said. The sound of that engine turning over wasn't pretty, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to find something, anything, in that circled spot on my father's chart. The Kraken's breath was waiting, and for the first time in a long time, I was coming for it. The Kraken's breath was waiting, and I was coming for it. December wind cut through my jacket, like it had personal business with my bones. For in the morning, 2 weeks before Christmas, and I was heading 40 miles northeast into waters that scare my father. Smart? No, but desperate people don't get to be smart. The Sea Wolf's rebuilt engine sounded like a jazz drummer who'd had too much coffee. All rhythm, no melody. Tommy had warned me she'd need babying. What he didn't mention was that babying meant checking the temperature gauge every 10 minutes and praying to whatever saint watches over idiots in boats. The weather report had promised calm seas. The weather report lied. By the time I cleared the harbor, swells were running 8 feet and building. The kind of chop that makes you taste breakfast twice. I had Dad's chart spread out on the console, weighted down with a rusty wrench and an empty coffee mug. The GPS coordinates he'd marked were burned into my brain. 43 degrees, 52 minutes, 31 seconds north. 68 degrees, 47 minutes, 14 seconds west. Numbers that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to me. 20 miles out, the temperature started dropping. Not gradually, like you'd expect heading into deeper water. This was like driving into an invisible wall of cold. My breath came out in clouds even though the cabin heater was cranked. The digital thermometer on my fish finder went from 48 degrees to 32 in the space of 100 yards. That's when things got weird. The water changed color. Not the normal blue to green shift you see near shore, but something else. It went dark. Not black exactly, but that deep blue you see in old paintings of the ocean. The ones that make you understand why sailors used to believe and see monsters. My cheap sonar started acting drunk. The depth readings jumped from 200 feet to 800, then to error messages. The surface temperature gauge just gave up and displayed question marks. I checked Dad's notes again. Right there in his shaky handwriting. Compasses spin. Electronics go crazy. Trust your gut, not your gadgets. My gut was telling me to turn around. My gut was also what had got me into this mess. So I kept going. At exactly 10:47 a.m., I reached the coordinates. The Kraken's breath. The spot my father had circled 3 times and apparently never returned to. The water here wasn't just cold. It was wrong. Still as glass despite the wind. Dark as midnight despite the morning sun. I brought a waterproof camera, one of those GoPro knockoffs I bought at a pawn shop for $30. The plan was simple. Lower it down, see what was there, probably find nothing, go home defeated. At least I'd have tried. I rigged it to a fishing line with a dive light zip-tied next to it. Real professional setup. Then I started letting out line. 50 feet, 100, 200. The screen on the camera's wireless monitor showed nothing but darkness and the occasional flash of particulate matter drifting past. At 300 feet, everything changed. The bottom came into view, but it wasn't bottom. Not sand or rock or mud. It was alive. The entire seafloor was carpeted with something that looked like giant mushrooms. If mushrooms were deep blue and pulsed with their own light. Hundreds of them. Thousands. As far as the camera could see. They were sponges. I knew that much from basic biology. But sponges like nothing I'd ever seen or heard of. They glowed with this bioluminescence that wasn't quite blue, wasn't quite purple. Like the color you see when you close your eyes and press on them. That's when I understood why nets came up empty here. Why the water was so cold. This wasn't a dead zone. It was the opposite. It was so alive, so purely its own ecosystem, that nothing else could survive here. The sponges had created their own world. 300 feet down, completely cut off from everything above. I pulled at the camera and just sat there for a minute, engine idling, trying to process what I'd seen. Then I did the stupidest and smartest thing of my life. I rigged up a makeshift dredge from an old bait net and a pipe wrench, and I went fishing for sponges. It took 6 tries. The first 5, the net came up empty or torn, but on the 6th try, I pulled up a piece, about the size of a baseball, deep blue-black, still glowing faintly even in daylight. It was firm but spongy like memory foam made of ocean, and cold, so cold it hurt to hold even with gloves on. I put it in a cooler with seawater and headed home, my hands shaking from more than just the temperature. I had no idea what I'd found, but I knew it was something. Something nobody else knew existed. Something that might, just might, be worth more than a pile of legal papers and a developer's check. The University of Maine's Marine Science building looked like every other academic building built in the 70s, all concrete and good intentions. I walked in carrying my cooler like it contained nuclear waste, which, for all I knew, it did. The receptionist looked at me like I'd wandered in from a fishing trip, which I guess I had. I told her I needed to speak to someone about a specimen. She started to give me the runaround until I opened the cooler. The glow from the sponge reflected off her glasses. She made a phone call. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Dr. Anya Sharma, and my life was about to change in ways I couldn't imagine. Dr. Sharma wasn't what I expected from a university professor. No tweed jacket or condescending attitude. She wore jeans and a Boston College sweatshirt, and she looked at my sponge like she just found the Holy Grail in a tackle box. Her grandfather, she told me while examining the specimen, had been a lobsterman out of Portland. He used to tell her stories about spots in the ocean where logic didn't apply. She'd become a marine biologist partly to prove him right. She ran preliminary tests right there in front of me. pH levels, cell structure, the works. Then she did something with a spectrometer that made her eyebrows shoot up to her hairline. She excused herself, made a phone call, came back with 2 other professors. They huddled over the data like kids with a secret. Finally, Dr. Sharma sat back down across from me. She said the sponge was producing compounds she'd never seen before. Unique proteins that shouldn't exist at these temperatures. And preliminary tests, very preliminary, she stressed, suggested these compounds were doing something interesting to cancer cells in their lab samples. Then she said the words that changed everything. We need to file a patent. Today. Now. Before anyone else finds out about this. I must have looked confused because she leaned forward and explained it like I was 5. The sponge was producing what could be a breakthrough pharmaceutical compound. If we were right, and that was a big if, we were looking at something worth millions, maybe hundreds of millions, but only if we protected it legally first. She called a patent attorney she knew. He drove up from Portland that night. By morning, we'd filed a provisional patent application with my name as the primary inventor and the GPS coordinates as proprietary information. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall and fast forward. The patent filing hit the biotech surveillance networks. Yes, that's a real thing. Within a week, we had calls from 3 major pharmaceutical companies. Within 2 weeks, a delegation from Viridian Oncology flew up from Boston. They weren't interested in buying the sponge. They were interested in buying the rights to whatever came from it. The negotiations were surreal. Me, a broke fisherman who'd been selling catch from a bucket 2 weeks ago, sitting in a conference room with lawyers and executives talking about milestone payments and royalty structures. Dr. Sharma was my secret weapon. She knew the science, knew the value, and most importantly, knew how to make these suits sweat. When they lowballed the initial offer, she started making calls to their competitors right there in the room. The final deal still doesn't feel real. $3 million up front for exclusive license to the patent. $50 million to build a research facility right here in our harbor. Not to destroy for condos, but to study what was living beneath it. And if, when Dr. Sharma insisted the compound made it through FDA trials, I get 5% of net sales. The check cleared on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, 8 days before my court date with Rick. My new lawyer, the one I could suddenly afford, called Rick's attorney that afternoon. The conversation was short. Given the scientific importance of the discovery and its connection to my inherited property, any attempt to force a sale would be against public interest. The judge would laugh them out of court. The case was dropped within hours. The news broke on Christmas Eve. Local fisherman discovers medical breakthrough made national headlines. CNN called it the catch of the century. Fox News ran with from fishing nets to internet millions. My phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days. Rick and Susan showed up on December 27th. I was expecting them. They stood on my doorstep like carolers who'd forgotten the words. Rick's politician smile was cranked to 11. Susan had traded her usual designer outfit for something she probably thought looked working-class casual. a $200 flannel shirt and jeans with a crease. Rick launched into a speech before I could even invite them in. How proud he was. How he'd always believed in me. How his pressure had motivated me to achieve greatness. Family sticks together, he said. Success should be shared, he said. Susan nodded along like a dashboard bobblehead, adding how she'd always told her friends about her brilliant brother-in-law, which was interesting since I'd heard her refer to me as Rick's boat person brother at a party just last year. I let them finish. Then I invited them inside where my lawyer was waiting with some documents of his own. The first document was a formal complaint to the National Association of Realtors and the State Licensing Board. Detailed documentation of Rick's attempt to force a sale for personal profit. Conflict of interest, coercion, breach of fiduciary duty. My lawyer had used all the fancy words. Rick's face went from fake tan to real pale. The second document was a purchase agreement. While Rick had been planning his condo empire, I'd bought out coastal living properties options on the adjacent waterfront. Every piece of land he'd been assembling for development now belonged to the Charles Miller Marine Research Foundation, Dad's name on a building that would help save lives. But I saved the best for last. I told Rick the foundation needed a maintenance supervisor, someone to keep the docks clean, handle the trash, meet the research vessels. $18 an hour, full benefits, honest work, the kind Dad had always respected. The offer was genuine. No tricks, no fine print. Just a job for a man who suddenly might need one. Rick's law practice wouldn't survive the ethics investigation. We both knew it. Susan's expression told me she knew it too. She was already calculating the social damage, the country club gossip, the charity committee whispers. They left without saying goodbye. Again, 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the fully restored Sea Wolf. She gleamed in the morning sun, her new engine purring like a satisfied cat. Dr. Sharma stood next to me, going over the latest research results. The compounds from the sponges were exceeding all expectations in trials. Down on the dock, a man in maintenance coveralls was emptying trash bins. Rick had taken the job. What choice did he have? His practice was gone, his reputation shattered. Susan had filed for divorce within a month, already latched on to some tech executive from Boston. Rick looked up, caught my eye. For a moment, I saw something I'd never seen before, understanding. He nodded just once and went back to work. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just nodded back. Standing there, watching the sunrise over the harbor my father had loved, I finally understood what he'd tried to teach me. Legacy isn't what you leave behind in things, boats or docks or money. It's what you leave behind in actions. The willingness to go into the unknown. The courage to trust your gut when everyone says you're wrong. The strength to stand alone when the whole world wants you to sit down. The Kraken's breath is still there, 40 miles northeast. We monitor it now, protect it, study it carefully. It's given up some of its secrets, but kept many more. Just like the ocean itself. Just like my father. And sometimes, early in the morning, when the fog rolls in and the diesel engines echo across the harbor, I swear I can hear him laughing. Not at Rick, not at the money, not even at the success. He's laughing because I finally learned to listen to what the sea was trying to say.